haven't checked the weather yet, but I know it is the perfect day to chat about adult Jewish literature. I'm Cheryl Stahl. Thanks for joining me here at Nice Jewish Books. Hello, today I have a special treat for our podcast. I've had several listeners ask me if I would ever consider having a poet discussing poetry on the podcast. And while I love the idea, I've always been a little intimidated by it. I really don't know how to talk about poetry. So I was talking with my Association of Jewish Libraries colleague, Yermiyahu Ahron Taub, about life, literature, libraries, as one is wont to do. And he mentioned that he had a poet friend that he would love to interview. So I was very interested in this idea. And then he mentioned the name, Irena Klepfisz, and I was thrilled. So in my college years, the three Bibles on my shelf were Our Bodies Ourselves, Nice Jewish Girls, and The Tribe of Dinah, which Irena edited with Melanie K. Kantrowitz. It just helped save my soul during a lot of transitional times in my life. So I am really thrilled to have both Yermiyahu Ahron Taub and Irena Klepfisz here on the podcast today. And Yermiyahu will be doing the bulk of the interviewing, and I'm going to mute myself and just soak in their love of literature and poetry. Hand it over to you, Yermiyahu.
Thank you so much, Cheryl. It is my great pleasure to welcome Irena Klepfisz to Nice Jewish Books. Irena is a lesbian poet, essayist, political activist, Yiddishist, practicing secular Jew, and the author of Her Birth and Later Years, New and Collected Poems, 1971 to 2021. The book was a finalist for the Jewish Book Award and a winner of the Audre Lorde Award for Lesbian Poetry. Irena, welcome to Nice Jewish Books.
Hi, Arla, who I know by the name of Arla, and I'm really, really pleased that the two of us can finally have a conversation. We've known each other for a really, really long time, but we've never really sat down and sort of talked shop, shall I say? So I think I'm looking forward to this conversation because it's, I think, been a long time in coming.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Erika, for this magnificent book. And congratulations on its success.
Thank you so much.
So as the book's subtitle states, the poems here cover a span of 50 years. Can you talk about how this new collection came about?
It was a big surprise to me, actually. What happened was that I had published a collection in 1990, A Few Words in the Mother Tongue. And the next decade, I was very involved mostly with prose writing on Yiddish, on performance pieces, essays, and I was doing a lot of organizing around Yiddish, and I did not publish any poetry. And starting in the aughts, I was writing poetry. I continued writing poetry, but I wasn't focused on publishing. And eventually, A Few Words in the Mother Tongue went out of print. And after my partner, Judy, died, and then 2 years later, my mother died, I decided to get back my rights to A Few Words in the Mother Tongue. And at the same time, because I wanted it to go into public domain. And I then went through all my journals and started looking at poetry that I had written and that I had never published or even tried to publish. And I came up with a collection called Her Birth and Later Years. And my good friend Julie Enzer, who's the editor of Sinister Wisdoms, loved the book and wanted to send it to basically to Wesleyan for them to publish. They really liked it, but they thought it was too short. And so then Julie had the great idea of, well, this other stuff is out of print, put together the whole book. And that's how the book was. And we sent it back to Wesleyan and they accepted it. It was not anything I had planned or thought about. And it was very easy. They were very eager to do it. And I had no problems. It was just remarkable, frankly, as a publishing story. I mean, I didn't look for a publisher. I didn't get rejected. It was like, it was an amazing, it was a new experience. Let me put it that way.
So in putting together a collection and, ushering it through that process, did you end up thinking about your poems differently? Do you find that they live in unexpected ways in this new collection?
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting process. When I was doing the galleys, I had to look at material that I had written 50 years ago. I mean, it was very strange in a certain way. I was a different person. I mean, when I was doing this, I was like 80, 81. And when I had published some of this, I was like in my early 30s. I mean, it's a big difference in terms of where I was in my life. And I was still, I think, experimenting. I mean, I think one of the things, I evaluated my poetry very differently, I think. I think I thought more of the early stuff in 1990 than I did now. But now I sort of thought of them as really interesting. And I had some distance in seeing my development. And I was very interested in the fact in the very early poem, for example, in Searching for My Father's Body, which is like 1974 or something, 73, or 71 even. I stuck into the poem like paragraphs from books. I mean, it was sort of an odd thing to do. It was not a traditionally poetic thing to do. And I thought about it, thinking about it, I thought it was kind of chutzpahdik and a little bit, nervy, because I was not really skilled yet, what I would consider, hadn't developed craft yet, but it was clear that I was trying to make poetry do for me what I wanted it to do, even though it looked bizarre. Do you know what I mean? I mean,
yes,
it was not very conventional. And I'm not sure it was very poetic, but I think it reflects the thing that I've been very focused on most of my time is form and how to write a certain poem, and that each poem has its own form, and they're not going to all look the same, and they're not going to all sound the same. And I think I was doing that from a very, very early time, not doing it really necessarily well, but I was seeing sort of the struggle. And for me, just personally, it's sort of interesting to have these early things to look at and to sort of see how they reflect that I was really thinking about these things, though I'm not sure even that I could have articulated it that way.
So you didn't take out any of the poems from the earlier books for this collection, correct?
No. And in fact, no, what happened was that in 1990, I put in some poems that hadn't been published before, like Searching for My Father's Body had never been published before. So, yeah. And then also, for example, the poems.
Even though it was dated 1971, right?
Right, because that's when it was written. That's when it was written. And so I was exactly 30. I mean, that was an interesting year. I mean, I had just thought of it right now because that was my birth. And I was very associated with I was born on my father's birthday. And he was killed 3 days after my second and his 30th birthday. So 1971, now that I think of it, I have to say, this is a first. I haven't put this together before, that I wrote that poem in 1971, which was my 30th birthday, and was a real crisis for me, sort of getting past my father's birthday. It's sort of interesting now that I think about it. I didn't think about it before.
Incredible.
Yeah, so, I've just had this epiphany about my own work that I didn't have before we started talking.
Yeah, well, I do want to get back to your father's presence, but one other question about the social milieu, the political milieu, out of which so much of your work arises. And in your acknowledgments, you note, as a poet, I was a fortunate beneficiary of the parentheses, mostly unpaid labors of countless lesbians and feminists who ran bookstores, coffee houses, conferences, and distribution centers, and who published women's newspapers and journals during the women's movement. So you've already mentioned that this book is published by a university press. Is this your first book of poems not published by a feminist or lesbian feminist press?
Absolutely.
And if so, how did the experience compare? Were there continuities? I think one of them was Out and Out book.
The Out and Out Books was the very first one, but it wasn't really, when we did it, this was for self-published. I self-published that. There was Jan Clausen, Ellie Bulkin, and Joan Larkin published the first version of Amazon Poetry, which became Lesbian Poetry, a bigger collection later. And Joan Larkin published Housework. And we all self-published our books because Anne put a imprint on it. We pretended we had a press because, vanity presses were considered, really looked down on. But nobody was going to publish us to begin with. And so Out and Out Books was a fiction. We each paid for our own books. We each had them printed separately and so on. The next was, I've published with Lesbian, with Persephone Press, with Eighth Mountain Press, Only Mountain Press. And even Nice Jewish Girls was originally published by Persephone, which was a lesbian press. And then there was Found Treasures, the Yiddish women's collection that I wrote the introduction to. That was published by a Canadian feminist press. So they were either women's presses or they were lesbian. And Wesleyan, I just never imagined, I have to say, that I would be published by any sort of, you know this, Avila, that university presses aren't exactly mainstream, but in a certain way they are mainstream. They're associated with academics, academic institutions and so on. And some of my sort of contemporaries managed to cross over, but I just didn't until this collection. And I was just shocked. It's been a totally different experience, I think, for a number of reasons, one of which everybody had was COVID changed a lot of stuff in terms of I'm immunocompromised, so it's limited. I'm sometimes limited about what I can do, a little more easy now. But when the book first came out, we were in the middle of COVID. And but the main thing besides COVID, even if it hadn't been COVID, and I talked about this to my contemporary writers, women writers, when we published in the 70s, 80s, and early 90s, we could go to any city that had a women's bookstore and we could give a reading, and we had an audience in which we understood each other. The givens we didn't have to talk about the givens. We didn't have to excuse ourselves for talking about lesbian stuff. We didn't have to, it was, even if you didn't know a single person in that city, it was just a very kind of Hamish experience because everybody was reading Off Our Backs or Gay Community News, and we all knew the same things. There was a common context. And first of all my readings since the book has come out have been on Zoom. I apologize. I did 2 readings, one at YIVO and one at a university, but I had to wear a mask until I got up on the stage, it's very weird. But they were audiences. With YIVO, it was different because there was this Jewish audience that a lot of people that I knew in New York. If I do readings if I would do a reading in Barnes and Noble, to me, it's very alien. I don't feel I know who my readership is in a way, or who's the audience for this book.
There's still independent bookstores, but they're struggling. They're barely hanging on. And it's not the same as that immediate network of feminist, queer bookstores that flourished or struggle, but we're there.
They're there, but what surrounds them is not the same thing.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I remember when bookstores were packed with people dying to see Minnie Bruce, Gloria Anzaldúa, Judy Grahn. It was like rock stars kind of. And that's just not the same. The movement isn't there to sort of, it really was, we were supported by the movement. That was it. That was really, I think, and when you publish like with Lesbian, they were really wonderful to me. I mean, I'm just amazed at the whole experience. It was one of the easiest things I've ever been through. And they're now even they're going to do a paperback, which I'm really happy about. So because one thing that I don't like is the price, but that's how it is. But it's just very different. It's I don't really know where this book is going. Do you know what I mean? I mean, it was like, I don't know who it's reached, where it's reached. And that so far, I mean, you know this, that reviews take a very long time. And so I'm still waiting. I know that it's been reviewed some. I'm hoping it will be reviewed more. So it's just a very different experience. It's much more it feels more isolated than the experience I've had before in the movement.
Irena, there are a number of key family members who figure prominently in the book, including your father, who you've mentioned already, your mother, your Aunt Gina. And the book begins with a poem, which you've already mentioned, about your father called Searching for My Father's Body. The footnotes section begins with a poem called March 1939, Warsaw, Poland. And I'd like to ask you to read March 1939, Warsaw, Poland, and maybe set it up for us beforehand.
I'll be happy to do. The last time I saw my father, I was 1.5. I mean, he died when I was 2, like I said, and he was 30. And I knew very little about him. He was very much a figure in the community I grew up with because he was a participant and an organizer of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. And he was, when we had memorial meetings, his one photograph that I have of him was always on the stage. And it's not a photograph of when he was an adult. It's a photograph. It's a school ID, 18, 19 years old. So he was always this sort of very heroic figure. My mother did not like talking about him, and she was very silent. I mean, she didn't want to answer a lot of questions. I think she had her own logic about why. I think she was essentially angry with him for dying. She was on the Aryan side. He chose to go back and died the next day, And so I don't have a lot of information. One of the earlier poems that I had about him was called About My Father, which I listed about 9 things I knew about him. I mean, it was sort of one of those minimalist poems. In 2016, I was made aware that there was a file. He was an engineer. He almost completed it when he died, but before the war started, rather, not when he died. But it turned out that for some reason, his was one of the files that survived the war at the Warsaw Polytechnic. They had a complete file on him. They had his birth certificates. They had his requests for financial aid. They had his grades. I mean, it was very strange to suddenly come across this. By the time I found this out, my mother had died, but she also had dementia, so she wouldn't have appreciated it. And it was a shock. I mean, it was this incredible shock. And the shock was also that the last handwritten note, I mean, it's the only thing I've ever held that my father actually had in hand, was this dated request for financial aid for the next semester for the fall, and was dated March 27th, 1939. And as my students generally don't know, but should know, September 1st, 1939 was when Hitler invaded Poland. So this is like 5 months before the beginning of the war. Everybody knows what's going on in Germany. It's not like Poland is in a vacuum, So I was very shocked. I mean, I couldn't even understand what this request was. It was 3 or 4 lines, but I understood the date. And the date just shocked me, March 27th, so close to the war. And I had this fantasy, obviously, as the poem says. I'll just read the poem. March 1939, Warsaw, Poland. I understand nothing but the date, March 27th, 1939. I want to whisper, grab everyone and run to the nearest port, the nearest border. But he is worried about tuition. He understands oppression, hatred, slavery, torture, but extermination, genocide, gas, ovens, Jacob, Miriam, Gina, Rikla, all his Bundeskonrads, fellow students, athletes, and Friedrich, extermination. I press, forget the silver, Baptist lace, forget the books, the photo albums, the anniversary brooch, forget diplomas, Jacob, Miriam's, Gina's, yours, Mayus's drawing. Just tell Rushka to hurry and get her mother. No time for goodbyes to Guta, Grisha, Mayus, but take the papers, money in the desk. Forget the protractor, rulers, pencils, notebooks. Take the knapsacks, pack scissors, clothes for layers, hat, scarves, a compass. Remember needle and thread, and also string, an extra pair of shoes. Talk calmly, but hurry the old ones. Go, run. Don't look back. Just go. Go. Micha, don't try to be a hero. Be my father. It's March 1939. In just 5 months, the butcher will begin grinding meat.
Incredible poem. Yeah, that line, don't try to be a hero, just really, you can feel its reverberation over the decades. I do want to read something. So in preparation for our conversation, I went back to Deures Bundisten, Generations of Bundes, of course, the Bund being the Jewish Labor Bund, group that advocated for Yiddish, for Jewish national autonomy, for democratic socialism, I would say, social democracy. And in it, they talk about your father, and they say, Michal's heroism was evident in 1934. He saved a child from a flooded cottage when the Dunayets River overflowed. His heroism was lauded by the district chief on the radio. He fought against fascist students in the Warsaw Polytechnic. He protested against the staging of a fascist play by Mussolini at the Polish Narodowy Theater. He was regularly seen at demonstrations. His generosity, good nature, and joyfulness created a warmth and friendliness towards him from his comrades. There was in his behavior an unpretentiousness, and he conducted himself as an ordinary soldier of the movement. And the last sentence of your father's entry in Deures Bundisten reads, the widow Rosa and the little daughter Irena survived and are now in New York. And it just, in reading this entry, it just seemed to me that so much of your life's work has been both about honoring your father's heroism and speaking about the social context, the political context, which nourished him, and your, the commitment to social justice, while also expanding beyond that single line about your mother and yourself to foreground the work and accomplishments of women who are so often left out. I wonder if you can reflect on that. It was just a thought that came to me as I was preparing.
Well, I'm glad you actually brought it up, because I think it's something I did very, very consciously. And I think the awakening to feminism and the women's movement was contributed to that and made me, in fact, look at the way the narrative, we like to talk about narratives, the narrative that I was handed, which was true, but incomplete, I would say. There was nothing wrong with it, except that it wasn't a complete narrative. And I now, when I think about it, or when I started really thinking about it, my father was killed a year and a half before the war ended. And I was really saved by my mother. I was at the time that the uprising happened, I was in an orphanage on the Aryan side. My mother was passing. She had Aryan papers. She was a maid for a Polish family. And she was left alone. She was 29 years old when he was killed. And she had a hidden child in an orphanage. She had phony papers, and the war dragged on for another year and a half. And she ended up basically when there was a second uprising, most people confuse it, called the Warsaw Uprising, which was the Polish uprising against the German, happened a year later in 1944, in late August, and went on in September, in which, I mean, Warsaw was decimated by that. I mean, there was nothing left of Warsaw after that. But my mother grabbed me. She didn't have permission, but she basically kidnapped me from the orphanage and left Warsaw. And she was isolated. She had lost contact with the underground. And by a miracle, she bumped into someone about a year later that reconnected her, and that helped us. My point is that my father's picture hung in the auditoriums and these memorial meetings, but not my mother's. And my mother was, and the feminist movement made me aware of that. I mean, in Bashert, the whole first section is about her saving me. And I think, that one of the things that the women's movement did, I think, and that I am very, very much support, is a whole redefinition of heroism. First of all, what is heroism? And, Grace Paley used to say heroism is being able to put bread on the table when your family is hungry. That's heroism. And I just started seeing the narrative in a different way. And I started seeing, everybody that I knew, whether they were Native Americans or whether they were Chicanas or they were African Americans, one of the effects of the women's movement is that everybody went back to their home community and said, where are the women? Everybody had the same kind of, limited narrative and wanted suddenly. So when I turned to Yiddish and Yiddish culture or women Bundes, or thought about my mother, people think that this is very, I don't know what, but it was really what everybody was doing. I did something, except I did it towards Yiddish and Jews and, Jewish women. But mostly everybody I knew did that. Somebody said something about how special being an activist were. Well, Agla, you're younger than I am. But, when I came out, anybody who came out had to be an activist. I mean, you couldn't avoid it. I mean, you were on the front lines in your whole life all the time dealing with stuff. So I don't consider it all that, unique or special or whatever. I mean, and so I think feminism, changed the way I looked at history, changed the way I looked at my own history, and was incredibly, I think, transforming for me. And certainly coming out, to me, that was a major shift. I don't know, we've never talked about coming out stories, but something to talk about. But when I came out, it was like the Holocaust took a different place in my brain. It was like I was coming into the present, and I had to deal with present issues that my parents had never even heard of. I mean, who knew about, gays? I don't know, they knew about them, but they certainly didn't talk about it in the Bund.
I always wondered about that. Yeah, it's like there had to have been. There's always been.
There's always been. They were hidden.
Yeah.
They were hidden, and they were.
Yeah.
But
everyone kind of knew, and they just couldn't. It was unspeakable.
Yeah, it was unspeakable, and I suspect, and I don't know for sure, that my father's sister was gay.
I was literally going to ask you that. Her picture. She is so butch.
I know.
It's like, I don't know if you can see any, it's blurry, but
I see that.
She is,
I know that.
She literally looks like a young man. Incredible face, so powerful, strong face.
She had a very, very close friend, a non-Jew, a non-Jew, a Polish woman who was my father and my aunt, both were very close to these two sisters who were in the PPS, which was the Polish Socialist Party. And they were not Jews. And these two sisters, the Savitskas, helped one of them, the other one, not Marysia. Anna was married to a Jew. Anna never married. Marysia never married. And I met her after the war. And her love for my aunt was hard to describe. And I just suspected that they were lovers. She asked me at one point if she could be, my aunt was passing when she died, so she was buried in the Catholic cemetery. And so my mother, after the war, my mother had her real name put down on But Marisha asked me if she could be buried with her. And she asked to be buried with her, but it didn't happen. But anyway, there were all kinds of small things aside from the picture, which have reinforced the photograph, And so I'm sure there were, but look, gay and trans issues were not on anybody's, the anarchists, the Zionists, the socialists, the communists, nobody had that on their radar, I mean, let's face it, hard as it may be.
Actually, there was several times, at least one time, where mentioned in the essay about your father, in Doris Bundisten, about he was arrested, but they didn't even think he was Jewish. They just thought he was a smuggler. So, but of course, later, I mean, he evaded arrests so many different times.
He could pass easily.
Yeah.
The time that he was arrested, they thought he was Polish. He was this Polish smuggler. And what I mean, his contacts with non-Jews were really important because he went in and out of the ghetto very frequently. He brought me out. He brought my mother out. He brought a lot of people out, but he also smuggled arms and he smuggled all the, I guess, chemicals that they needed for the Molotov cocktails, because he set up these small kind of factories in the ghetto before the uprising with Molotov cocktails. So he moved very, very easily. So he was lucky that that looks mattered. Let's put it that way, looks mattered.
Yeah. So I have a couple of sort of poetics type of questions. So and maybe I'm just kind of making too much of this, but it seems like, at least in a lot of your early work, there aren't a lot of commas. And also there isn't a lot of capitalization. There's some, but there's also definitely whole sequences where you avoid capitalization and commas. And I'm wondering if you feel like they somehow interrupt the flow of words or distract from the visual experience, or maybe it's like a gesture to kind of reframe what's possible in your poetics. I wonder if you could just reflect on those kinds of questions.
I think there are times, it's not exactly kind of directly logical in the sense, or that I could rational, I would rather say. It's non-rational. It's not irrational, but it's non-rational. Kind of instinctive thing. There are times when it depends on the voice I'm using, and sometimes when I'm using what I would consider an unexpressed voice that's not really talking out loud, I would use lowercase and try to minimize a kind of, I don't know if it works, but it's just an instinctual thing, like with the monkeys, for example, or some of those early poems. I think especially in periods of stress, when I had a very brief, I came out when I was 33, and I came out 4 years after Stonewall. And at the same time that I lost my first and only full-time teaching job at LIU. And I decided at that point, when I lost my job, I was going to go out to the ocean and write poetry. I'd always wanted to live by the ocean.
You lost your job as a result of coming out?
No.
Oh, no. Okay.
Terry cut. It all happened at the same time, though. And so I decided to drive. I didn't know how to drive. I learned how to drive. I got a car and I went out to Montauk and I had this brief relationship with this woman to try to figure out who the hell I was. I was 33 years old, 34. And a lot of the poetry that you're talking about kind of were written at the beginning there because I was trying to figure out who the hell I was. I didn't know if I was gay. I had never thought about it. But I think it was because I passed my father's 30th birthday, because I had sort of dealt with my survival guilt and all kinds of things. I was ready to sort of enter the present. When I entered, and which is why I never talked about sexuality, because it wasn't I was in the past. I had to get out of the past. And so I went to Montauk. And so a lot of the poems there are sort of my very internal, I don't know how they read to other people. I mean, to me, it's a kind of, I'm not that crazy about them, but it's about my struggle really to find out who I am, because it's all about fluidity and rocks and sand and water and what's sand. It's kind of because I was living right by the dunes and right by the ocean, and it was like my fantasy, but I was so fucking lonely. I mean, it was so isolating. But it was very good. And at the end of the summer, I started going to this lesbian bar, Shape Patches, it was called. It was Shape Pat, but we called it Patches. And Rock the Boat was the main song. And there were like 500 dykes in the place, and the whole place was rocking. And I sort of knew I had come home. I mean, this was perfect. So I think a lot of those poems come out of that angst kind of the struggle of deciding and figuring out, and how do you know, and and what do you know, and when did you know, and so I also think like, and I'm thinking I don't do it as much as I do it now, but I think, for example, I think I did it in that poem where I'm trying to deal with the mourning and Judy's death, and one of the very later poems. And I think it's Entering the Stream. Any of those in the mourning cycle, a lot of those are internal. And I think I know, Between Shadows and Light. I don't use any capitalization, so on. That's a very internal poem. And it seems like it's very hard to explain. It's a very instinctive thing that I start with a poem and I know exactly whether it's going to be uppercase and whether it's going to be punctuation. I don't know what, I can't really explain it, but I think, and like even in the work sonnets, I think I'd switch with capitals in one voice does capitals and one voice doesn't, because there's the one voice that's in the office, and then there's the cosmic kind of shifting of global whatever that I do. So yeah, there is some logic to it, except I find it hard to articulate.
Got to trust your process. Yeah. Your voice, your drive. So another sort of strategy are your use of Yiddish words. And I wonder if you could speak about your thoughts around that. Like, when do you integrate Yiddish words into your writing, and how do you do that? I mean, at some point you decided that you're not going to write fully in Yiddish, but you definitely, I mean, Yiddish is clearly a part of your literary impulse, a drive. Can you just, share some thoughts about how and why and what role Yiddish plays in your creativity?
Well, there was practically no Yiddish at the beginning, and it was really a sort of realization, which my friend Gloria Anzaldúa, who was a Chicana from Texas, and if you know Gloria's work, I mean, half of it is in Spanish. I mean, she's very bilingual in her work, and she also doesn't translate any of the Spanish most of the time. And I became friends with her in the early 80s, and we had long discussions about this, partly about this issue. And she sort of made me self-conscious that I had Yiddish in my background. I mean, I did postdoc work in Yiddish. But what people don't really realize about me and my Yiddish is that Yiddish was not my mama lashon. Polish has always been my mama lashon. I mean, I spoke Polish to my mother till my late teens, and I never used it in conversation. I mean, I just didn't.
Never use Yiddish.
I mean, people wanted me to. I could, and I did when forced to. When I went to middle shul and whatever, and when
Bundes gatherings.
I tried not to. I mean, the thing was that by the time I came to the United States, English was my fourth language. And I understood everything because I was around Yiddish speakers from the time the war was over, in Lodz and then in Sweden and here. And I always understood everything, but I never spoke. And I didn't go to shul until I came here. And at that point, I was ahead of the other kids because I understood everything, but I couldn't read or write, and I didn't speak. And simultaneously, I was trying to learn English, and I had enormous resistance. I was very unhappy here. I'm sure it was psychological because I picked up Swedish in no time, and I spoke Swedish, and I wrote Swedish and all of that. And it was my worst subject in school, English. It kicked me out of honors English. I mean, it was just traumatic. And it continued. I just had problems with English grammar. I just had I couldn't write essays. I mean, people in college, they used to give me 2 grades, A for content, D for grammar. I mean, it was like a nightmare. It sort of carried a little bit into graduate school. So my whole struggle was to try to, and one of the reasons I turned to poetry was because I thought that nobody could tell me I did something wrong in a poem. So, and which was sort of not the brightest of ideas, but it was an approximation. And so I started writing some poetry, and, for myself. I didn't show it. I was very secretive. I didn't show it. I was embarrassed. I finally started showing it to one friend in graduate school, and Paula showed me hers. But that was it. So when the idea of trying to switch from, my whole struggle was to master English. And I struggled with it. I struggled with it in the poetry. I was just a struggle. And once I felt finally, the essay part of it stayed with me for a long time. I ended up writing a lot of essays. I was very insecure about it. I had to have feedback from friends. Judy looked over everything. I was so insecure, I can't tell you. Poetry, I never shared with anybody. They either liked it or didn't like it. I didn't want feedback. I didn't want to hear about it. But with the essays, it was different. So the idea that I should write in Yiddish was so, to me, like, it was going to break me. I fought so hard to feel grounded in English that I couldn't even consider it. And also I wasn't speaking it. In the sense that, and I resisted speaking it. I was embarrassed. I was afraid I'd make a mistake. I had long conversations in Yiddish with Schechter, Chava Schechter. He told me I have a complex, and he said, your Yiddish is really fine. You just have a complex.
This is Dr. Mordechai Schechter, the eminent Yiddish linguist.
Yeah, and I spoke with Yiddish to Max Weinrach, was my teacher at City College. But I still have it. It's just a problem. So
having these words interspersed gives you a way.
Yes. And I wanted, in some ways, I didn't want to fake it. In some ways, I wanted it to reflect sort of the fragmentation that I experienced with Yiddish.
Yeah.
And I thought it was a good compromise. The problem was that people sort of expected me to do it all the time. And as you know, if I were, let's say, I'm writing a poem about Judy and mourning. I didn't speak with Yiddish with her. She didn't know. She wasn't Jewish, for one thing. She didn't know Yiddish. If I put in a Yiddish word there, it would change somehow something. So in other words, I had to decide when to use it. And that was a big question. What was it? When was it appropriate and didn't change the poem in some way? Do you know what I mean?
Yes, absolutely.
And that was, I did it for a while, then I didn't do it. And then somehow, don't ask me how, Fremder in the Fremdschaft, popped up.
Yeah.
I loved it came to me in Yiddish first because I loved the idea of the Fremder in the Fremd, which you can't duplicate in English.
Right.
It means the stranger in the strange. That's what it means. If you want to, not in the strange land or away from home. In der Fremd is an interesting phrase.
Such an interesting phrase. So hard to translate. Means different things in different contexts. One of the many seemingly simple phrases in Yiddish that really aren't.
But the root is fremd because der Fremde is the stranger. To me, it was appropriate in that poem because I was talking about immigration, and I feel that that's a very Jewish experience, my experience. There was a reason for doing that.
Yeah.
Other places, not so much. It's, I don't know, it changed.
No, that definitely helps. Yeah, that's really, really powerful. So, Irke, you've been a pioneering advocate for the work of Yiddish women writers, really for a very long time. Your translation of The Shorn Head by Fradelstock appeared in the aforementioned Tribe of Dinah. It came out, I believe, in 1986. You wrote the introduction to Found Treasures, the anthology of Yiddish women's writing, that came out in 1994. And there's a poem in this book called Stuck. And I wonder if you can read that for us. The poem is on page 186.
She's a Yiddish writer who was purportedly died in a mental institution. That's important for the poem. And the poem has an epigraph from Czesław Miłosz, the Polish poet in exile. Language is the only homeland. So this is Stuck speaking. I'm taking on her voice. They make it sound easy, some disjointed sentences, a few allusions to mankind. But for me, it was not so simple, more like trying to cover the distance from here to the corner or between two sounds. Think of it, heim and home. The meaning the same, of course, exactly. But the shift in vowel was the ocean in which I drowned. I did try, first held with Yiddish, but it's hard. You write gas, and street echoes back. No resonance. And let's face it, memory falters. You try to keep track of the difference like Gott and God, or Huis and house, but they blur when you start using alley, when you mean Gesele, or avenue, when it's a boulevard. And before you know it, you're on some alien path, standing before a brick house, the doorframe slightly familiar. Still, you can't place it exactly. Passers-by stop. Concerned, they speak, but you've heard all this before, the vowels shifting up and down, the subtle change in the guttural sounds. And now it's nothing more than babble. And so you accept it. You're lost. This time you really don't know where you are. Land or sea, the house floats before you. Perhaps you once sat at that window and it was home and looked out on that street or Gesele. Perhaps it was a dead end. Perhaps a shortcut. Perhaps not. A movement by the door. They stand there beckoning, mouths open and close. Come in, come in. I understood it was a welcome. A dank, I said, till I heard the lock snap behind me.
Wow.
So, the problem with the ending is that it turned out she didn't die in a mental. The great Norma Fayen Pratt, she wrote a play about her also with this information. That was the story about Fradl, that she died in a mental institution. She didn't. She went to California and she tried even publishing afterwards. Norma Fayen Pratt did all kinds of wonderful research on her. So, but that's all I knew at the time. And I usually put a footnote or a note about sort of, I didn't want to spoil the poem, but I always say it's.
But sometimes there's that myth there's so much richness in the myth.
Right.
How did the myth start? How did so much to unpack in just that myth? I just love that line. But the shift in vowel was the ocean in which I drowned.
Yeah. Those are the kinds of lines, I have to say, that I don't know if you experienced this, Agla, but there are times when things just pop out of you that just, you don't edit it, you don't anything, you don't even know how it happened. I always feel like I can't even take credit for it because it just happens. I don't know how to release it. If I knew how to release it, I'd have more of them, but just like. Creativity
is such a mystery.
I know, I tell this in workshops. People think there's certain things you just, I don't know how that line, I know it's a really good line, but I just don't know how it happened. And you don't edit them afterwards. They're uneditable. They're just like there.
They were meant to be.
It's
almost as if they'd always been there.
You channel someplace else. I don't know.
And we should note also that a book-length volume of translations of stories by Fradl Stock by Jordan Finken and Alison Schechter called From the Jewish Provinces was published recently. And they were interviewed on another nice Jewish book podcast. I believe that was at the end of last year, 2022. So do check that out. Erica, I wanted to transition into a discussion, something that you talk about on your book jacket, where you identify as a practicing secular Jew. And your essay, Secular Jewish Identity, Yiddishkeit in America, appeared in the Tribe of Dinah, which, as we mentioned, you co-edited. And then it was also republished in Dreams of an Insomniac, Jewish Feminist Essays, Speeches, and Diatribes. Can you talk about what practicing secular Jew means to you? Has your conception of Jewish secularism evolved since those days when you wrote that essay?
Well, first of all, I have to say that the phrase practicing secular Jew only occurred when I did the bio for this book. And I wish I had started using it 30 years ago. And I know a lot of people just love it. I mean, there's secular Jews who love that I stuck in practicing in there, because secularism was always associated like with assimilation. Secularism is, when I wrote Secular Jewish Identity in the Tribe of Dinah, and I went to a lot of women's studies conferences, women were coming up to me and said, I didn't know, I thought I was nothing, and now you tell me I'm a secular Jew. and it was like amazing to me.
There's a power in that naming.
Yes, and it was amazing to me that women who didn't observe and who came maybe rejected observance somehow then saw themselves as nothing, when in fact they were doing all kinds of things. The practicing, I'm glad I finally found it, but I wish I had found it like 30 years ago. Hard to be an active, maybe it should be an active, practicing is the same thing, practicing, because most of the time, we don't have defined institutions like observant people have. There's a whole spectrum of observance, from...
Well, there is the whole humanistic Judaism movement. Did that ever speak to you in any way?
Because it still involves some secular prayers, which I think is doesn't work for me. I believe in sort of strong, I'm not totally non-observant in the sense that I went into my first synagogue when I was like 44 or something. I'd never been in a synagogue. And it was at the time, it was in, I can tell you exactly when it was in 1982 when the Sabra Shatilas massacre occurred, and I was upstate, and I heard Jews were, I don't know, I went with Judy, and I took Judy to the synagogue upstate. I thought I should be with other Jews. I always heard about secularism in relationship to Yiddish. It was Yiddish cultural autonomy. It was cultural autonomy that was really important for the Bundes. And that was expressed through the language, Yiddish and Yiddish culture. So I always heard it just in relationship to Yiddish versus religious observance, and versus also at the time Zionism, because the Bund and the Zionists were
Yoikite, earness, yeah.
And so that was always associated. Secularism was associated with Doakite, not Hebrew, whereas Zionism was always pushing for Hebrew. So I came to see it, of course, when we enlarge. People talk about the influence of feminism on the larger society, and I also like to think of the larger society influencing the community. So I feel like racism in the Jewish community only became aware when we started talking about racism outside of the Jewish community. Jewish feminists didn't talk about multiculturalism at the very beginning. Everything seemed to be Ashkenazi. It's as we all became more aware of America's, interaction, we started saying, oh, there are Jews who aren't Ashkenazi. There are Jews, Mizrahi Jews, Jews of color, whatever. So I think my sense of secularism broadened tremendously. It also started including English material. And that's one of the things I think, I don't know if it's in that essay or in another essay where I talk about, that there's Jewish books have been written in French and in Spanish and in English. And it's not just even limited to the Jewish languages, in other words. And people are writing about Jewish life in other languages. And that's part of the secular, I think, in that it's broadened completely. What we don't have is really, and I don't think for me, anything I I'm comfortable latching on to as kind of secular institution, because I mean, students often tell me that they feel it's difficult to be a secular Jew because they feel isolated and they don't feel that there's a place to go to. Like if you know,
a synagogue.
yeah,
I mean, there are Jewish community centers, which can sometimes function that way.
yeah. But when I once spoke to a Hillel director, a student, I don't know, she was a student rather than the actual whoever runs Hillel, but she was like the Hillel president voted by the students. She said to me, well, everything that we do is secular, really. And what she really meant was what the original women were saying. It's like they didn't have to do anything and it would be secular. But I said to her, you need to be consciously secular in the sense of that you have to be, it's not enough to give your characters Jewish names. If you're going to give them Jewish names, unless they're totally assimilated, then give them some Jewish content. And if it's not going to be a synagogue that they go to, then it has to be something else, you know? And I mean, if it's going to be a Jewish rooted book, it should be rooted not just in the name, that because somebody's called Josh Cohen, and this is, you know, Sheila Rubin, and then that's it. I mean, that to me is not really secularism. I mean, like that, I mean, it's certainly Jewish, but it's not what I would consider a real rootedness in any kind of secular Jewish culture. And that's drawn and it's changes. And, you know, I mean, I don't know, how do you define it? I mean, how do you see it from your end? I mean, I would consider you now in all your work, secular work.
Oh, we're switching roles here.
Just for five seconds.
A few seconds. I'm sort of in between. Yeah, kind of in between. Influenced by religious culture. Don't go to regular synagogue services, but my sort of poetic and intellectual cosmos is deeply informed by religious cycles, religious thought, religious ways of being. I mean, I dip in and out more so before COVID, you know, to the Orthodox familial world. But I do want to mention that in that biographical entry on your father in Deures Fundisten, it's mentioned that he was part of a large branch, a wide-ranging, widely branched rabbinic family, including one of, it doesn't say exactly how he was related, but maybe you know this, Reb Shmuel Zanvil Klepfisz, who was... He was a grandson. He was a grandson? Okay.
He's my great-grandfather.
Oh, okay. And Reb Shmuel Zanvil was for 30 years head of the yeshiva. He was 46 years a Moira Hora, who, you know, qualified to answer questions, close to 30 years head of the rabbinate in Warsaw. He was renowned when Jews couldn't reconcile certain matters. They said, we must go to Reb Zanvila. And so this is also part of your fascinating Yerusha, rabbinic yichus, secular yichus. It's all in this, you know, incredibly rich genealogical lineage that makes or helped to form you, you know, in a way.
Well, I've always thought that my interest in literature and looking at texts very closely, which I love to do, explicating things and so on, came from that rabbinic tradition that is very rabbinic of me, in fact. I mean, the story of that is Zanvil Klepfisz. I mean, actually, Judy and I went to a store once that when they saw my name said, there's a Zanvil Klepfisz. I mean, they were talking about Zanvil Klepfisz in Brooklyn, which shocked me. I was
Amazing.
really, I was stunned. But I mean, that story is that my grandfather, my father's father, Yankov, broke with, I mean, my grandfather.
Yes, they said he was a chassid in his youth, Yankov.
And then he broke with the Bund because he became a Bundist. And he remained a really strong Yiddishist. And he taught Yiddish. My grandmother, his wife, Miriam, my grandmother, taught in a Polish school. He taught Yiddish schools. But they were
both teachers, Miriam Roisa and Yankov.
Yes, and they both spoke to Michał and Gina in Polish. I know the contradictions and paradoxes are amazing.
And I think Miriam Royce's mother was a midwife.
She was observant, and they had to keep kosher, and they had to do all kinds of things because she was living with them at the time of the war. Before the war, that's Babcha Solomon.
Guta, that you mentioned in one of the poems, was that one of Miriam Royce's sisters?
Guta was my mother's sister.
Oh, mother's sister. Okay. Yeah.
Well, there was only Michał. My mother had there were 6 children in my mother's family. 3 did not survive, 3 did. 2 of the families are in Australia, in Melbourne.
Another center for Yiddish culture. So I wanted to ask, so the header of the book's back cover states, collected poems of a pivotal Jewish lesbian activist. And I found that fascinating. There's so much contained in those words. And I wonder if you can talk to us about balancing activism and poetry. How do you do it?
Well,
when you're writing, do you feel like you should be organizing? Or maybe that divide itself is arbitrary. Maybe it's you see your writing as activism.
I mean, I think it wasn't a conscious thing. I mean, Judy actually liked to pull me back. I mean, Judy loved my poetry, and she always wanted me to do less activism and do more poetry. But I don't know. I mean, I went through a period, I mean, in various ways where I was very, very active. I mean, my life right now is so unlike my previous life. I mean, I haven't been to a protest mainly because of COVID. I've been afraid. And so, I mean, I just read about things. I think more than actually activism that held me back, it was economics. And I think that was true with Judy. I mean, it was not having enough jobs or the right jobs we were very broke a lot of the time. And that, I think, had a profound effect on my writing. And that's one of the reasons I wrote a lot about work, because it took up a lot of time about work. But in terms of activism, I mean, I just felt that there were things I wanted to do and had to do. I couldn't, when Lil Moed, who was a Jewish lesbian older woman, she was a kind of mentor to me, came to me and said, women in Black are protesting, started after the first Intifada. I don't know. I just picked up the phone and I called my friend Claire Kinberg, and we called Grace Paley, and we said, we've got to support these women in Jerusalem and Tel Aviv. I mean, it was like, what are you going to do with this information? You're not going to let them stand alone over there. So I don't know. It was a draw. I mean, this was all, of course, unpaid work. And so put a strain on other kinds of work. I feel it in some ways it fed my poetry. I mean, I certainly broadened my themes, my topics, so they were not only focused on my life, but on other things. It's a tension. There's no doubt about it. It's a tension. And it can be frustrating sometimes. I've talked about it to other people, but like I say, most writers I knew were really activists also. There was no such thing as just doing your work. You had to be out there so that the work could be accepted, and your work and other people's work could also be accepted. It wasn't just about you in some way. And most of
it was work connected to a movement, emanating from and connected to.
And it was also, we were working towards a society in which our work could be accepted and the work of others could be accepted. I mean, that was part of it too. So it doesn't seem so, there's a tension. But like I say, in some ways, I never resented my political work, but I did resent some of the crummy jobs I had to take.
Erica, there's another key figure. We've already talked extensively about her, and that's your mother. And there's so many moving poems about your mother in her birth and later years. And I wonder if you could read one of them called Der Mama's Shabbosim, and that's on page 188, right after the Fradelstock poem.
Yeah, I wrote this poem after I read Chaim Grader's memoir, Cholos or Damam Shabbosim, but he wrote a memoir in which the first part described his mother, Vela Grada, in this really moving section. They were incredibly poor, living in a hovel. She was a widow. She was trying to support him with selling apples. I mean, it's just a horror story. And he was, of course, this unrepentant yeshiva student who was rebelling, and she was always worried she was going to be late for Shabbos. And it's just very poignant. And of course, I'm a little competitive. So I decided that I was going to write my mother's Sabbath days. But as I've said, we were secular, so we had no Sabbath day. We had no Shabbosim. But I decided to write it anyway. And the only thing you should really know is at this point, my mother became ultimately an archivist, but she originally earned a living by being a seamstress. And she did piecework. But she ended up at this point, when I'm writing the poem, she was working for a fashion designer, which was very glamorous. I mean, she was very exacting and so on. There were 4 shows a year and there were models. I mean, it was hard work, but it was. And so this is a poem about my mother's Sabbath days, Damam Shabbosim, inspired by Vela Grada. Bei uns ist es gewesen anders. I knew nothing of the 613 mitzvahs which did not bind me, nor of the 3 which did, though I am sure my grandmother, Rikla Perchikov, knew them all, and I have a vague image of her covering her eyes and swaying. Shoshana, Rushka, Lodja, Mama Law, and more recently Rose, in short, my mother in all her reincarnations, did not pass on such things. She'd given them up even before she'd ever claimed them. She was more modern, and besides, there were other matters to teach. So by age 11, bin schon gewesen brennende Sozialistka. I was a passionate socialist, so impatient to grow into my knowledge, never guessing there was no choice for work and rest, wrestled in every human life, with work, inevitably the unbeatable winner. So for us, it was different. Erev Shabbos was plain Freitag, or more precisely, Piontek. I remember summer evenings, I wait for her at the Mashalu stop of the Lexington line. Bright heat and light at 6 o'clock. She was full of tales of Miss Kant, the designer, a career woman longing for home and family, in love with a handsome pilot, of Scotty, the model, who married smart and a wealthy buyer, and now sat brazenly chic in a reformed synagogue. I listened eager to understand these widow tales of romance amid the rush of each season's showing, and once even saw on the page of the Times a mannequin dressed in the very gown Mama Law had made. All the way up Jerome Avenue, we'd walk past the Jewish deli where we never ate. What was the point if you could make it at home? Past the pizza place where occasionally while shopping, she'd buy me a slice. Past the outdoor groceries, fruit stands, fabric, shoes, lingerie, and stationery stores, till Gun Hill Road and Jade Gardens. Perhaps I knew it was Trafe. She certainly did, but was not concerned. We'd order the salty wonton soup, chow mein, or pepper steak. And though she mocked the food, she never resisted. It was Friday. The shop was closed. We'd eat dinner and, like the rich, lean leisurely back in our booth. I didn't know it was Erev Shabbos. Still, she rested.
Ah, just magnificent. Really just so beautiful. And I see again that interplay between religion, not religion, reforming religious concepts, awareness of, but not following. That interplay is so rich and exciting and moving to hear. I think, did I read somewhere that your mother felt, or maybe you had said something about, caught between her, her husband who tragically died young, who was a hero, and now her very famous poet daughter? Like, was there?
I think there was, actually.
Okay.
My mother was very, I mean, I certainly understood it because as a child, I was often introduced as Michal Klepfish's daughter. No, and people didn't even sometimes know my name. I mean, and it really bothered me. I had to really deal with this as I was growing older, especially in my teenage and early 20 years. I didn't like it. I wanted people to know me. And she was always identified as Michal Klepfish's widow. My friend Meredith Tax, I don't know, do you know her work? I mean, Rivington Street and those labor novels. She went to do research at the Joint Distribution Committee, JDC, which was this relief organization that my mother became an archivist. And she walked in and she was introduced, and she wanted some materials from my mother, from the archives. So she got introduced as Rose Klepfisz, and Meredith said the absolutely wrong thing. She said, "Oh, are you Irena's mother?" My poor mother. So she sort of became, and she joked about it, but I think it was a kind of painful joke for her that in the end, that people were seeing her. There were a lot of these, and she was not easy about my being gay. Let me put it that way. But she also liked being like, she went to, if it was in New York, if there was a conference and we were selling the Tribe of Dinah, she sat at the table and sold copies. I mean, she liked that because it also brought her attention and stuff. But she did get caught. I mean,
And she was proud of you.
Yeah, she was.
Right?
She was also a little bit jealous. I mean, it was a complicated relationship. But I mean, I have photographs of her with Melanie and Linda at the time, Linda Vance, and she was also very guarded. I mean, she didn't boast about herself very much. I mean, she was remarkable. She started working when she was 12. She never really had, when she got the job at JDC, she lied. She said she had gymnasium, but she didn't. When she got the job, she had been working at YIVO on the first multilingual bibliography of the Holocaust. This was like in the early 60s. She got this job by a fluke. And she really trained under really like Baron and Friedman, these Holocaust scholars. She got trained at YIVO doing that work. And then eventually she got the job at JDC. And when she got the job at JDC, they didn't have an archive. They had a warehouse with boxes of documents. She put it all together. I mean, it was amazing. But she never really she didn't want to talk about it on the one hand. And then she sort of resented that she didn't get sort of public credit. She was complicated.
But it's so beautiful that you're honoring her in this way, speaking about her, writing about her, speaking honestly about those complexities. It's really rich and beautiful to read and learn about. In your acknowledgments, you also mention your trip to Poland in 2017, and then after that as well. And I wonder, can you talk about those trips? Was the 2017 trip first in a long time? Okay. Since the first one since the war?
No. I had a number of trips to Poland, but it's really, as I like to say, I really didn't see Poland. I went with my mother in 1983, which was the 40th anniversary of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. We didn't go for the official ceremony. She didn't want to, and we went afterwards. And we spent a week in Poland. We saw Marek Edelman. That's when I saw my Aunt Gina's friend, Marysia Sawicka, who was already at that point probably in her 70s. And then I stopped a few times. I went there for the Bund anniversary, for the 100th anniversary of the Bund. There was a conference, I went. And then there was Marek Edelman's funeral. I mean, most of these were like very quick trips. My mother put up a symbolic stone for my father in the Jewish cemetery in Warsaw. So, these were like 2 or 3, a few days. And all I did was go to cemeteries, and I didn't really do anything. But then Gabby, who is here, somehow found out about one of my poems, Bashert, and we met in 2016. And in 2017, I went for almost 3 weeks, and Gabby and her husband drove me around Poland. I mean, I went to Krakow, I went to Lublin, I went to Sejny, I went to Zakopane, which I always wanted to go to because that's where my parents met, because there was nothing left in Warsaw to look at from that period. But I knew that they had gone skiing. They had all these trips. these Jewish organizations that, Olympics in Zakopane, Jewish Olympics. And so I knew my parents met there, so I wanted to go down there, and I went there. They took me all over Poland for 3 weeks, and they introduced me to a lot of people and wonderful people. And it was just a fabulous expansion of what my relationship to Poland is. I mean, I just changed sort of. You've come across this, I'm sure. A lot of people won't go to Poland. I mean, they're very bitter about.
Yes.
And people were furious with my mother for speaking with me in Polish when we got here. People were furious with her. She got a lot of. I'm very grateful, actually, she didn't change languages, because I had enough to deal with without having to do that. So, I mean, Gabby has been just enormously wonderful, and she's actually here helping, not helping me, but almost doing it herself. We're trying to catalog Judy's paintings because I want to try to see if I can get them better known, her work better known. So she was incredibly prolific.
And the book is dedicated to Judy, your life partner,
Yes.
Judy Waterman.
Yeah. Painting on the cover is her painting.
Can you talk about how that painting was selected?
I picked it. I loved it.
It's an amazing painting.
I loved it, and I didn't think that they would use it. I didn't want to even send it, but Zoe Zohar happened to be in New York, and I talked to her about it, and I showed her the thing, and I wanted that. She said, well, send it. All they can do is reject it, and then you can send them something else. So I sent it, and they said, in 10 minutes, they said, we want it.
How would you describe it? We're on a podcast. How would you describe it visually?
Well,
to our listeners?
I used to call it the happy coffin. And
I mean, it's literally a coffin filled with what looks like
a lot of
party confetti or
flowers, and it's gigantic. It's as big as what's behind me right now, which you probably can't see, but I will send you a photograph, both of you, a photograph of what the original looks like, because we just tagged it and I photographed myself with it, and you'll see it's enormous. I just thought it was because this is about, the book is really about birth and death. I mean,
yeah,
and
there it is, captured in that image.
And I made it a joke, and her later years, her birth.
A joke with tremendous consequences.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Her birth and later years. I mean, what does that mean? So I thought it was an appropriate, actually, painting. I thought right away that that's the one I wanted.
So we're nearing the end of our conversation. I feel like I can talk with you for hours and hours, but I wonder if we could begin to wrap things up with you reading a poem called A Poem for Judy, and that's on page 118.
Sure. A Poem for Judy, beginning a new job. Judy, when I was the only person I ever met who didn't want to have something to fall back on in case she couldn't make it with her art. And so she organized her life around night jobs so that she could paint during the day. But she couldn't always do that. And this is a poem when she could not do that. And she took a job for the day, a temporary job during the day. A Poem for Judy, beginning a new job. I will keep this simple, not give it universal significance, nor transform it into art. You say, I will not do this forever. I will paint. I've learned now that it's no solace to point out the others, so many others, straining, wasting, unable to do what they know they must do. For such loss is always solitary and unshared, outside the scope of bloodless theory. You do not paint, and what must happen does not happen. The transformation on the empty canvas of the elusive marble into the shadowy water, or of the simple water into impenetrable rock. And nothing, not even loving embrace, nor special intimate midnight talk, will ever make up or diminish that loss for you, or for her, or her, or her.
Amazing, amazing poem. I love how the beginning of a new job is kind of part of the title, but it's also an epigraph. It's kind of in between place. And of course, keeping it simple and it's not simple, and not giving it universal significance, but yet expounding upon how this is something that happens to so many people. Yeah, it's just an incredible, incredible poem. And it really, we talked about this earlier, work is such a big part of this book. Who gets to pursue, their career, their work dreams, who's doing, office work. Some of the most moving poems in this book are the work sonnets, where you grapple with so many complicated questions of what work gets valued, what work gets acknowledged, what work gets seen, and then also looking deeply at the lives of the workers, their complexity, their ambivalent, ambiguous status, interaction with that work. So yeah, I wonder if you could just reflect on the role of work in your writing and in your career, and how to both give it dignity, but also acknowledge, the unfairness, also, and the fact that certain kinds of work can be mundane. And
Yeah. I mean, Judy and I both really struggled financially. I mean, like I said, I lost my job in 1973 as a full-time teacher. I hated graduate school, but I got a PhD because I thought it would give me a living. I could earn a living, because I knew I had no interest in like writing scholarly work. I didn't want to turn my dissertation into a book. I mean, the second I finished it and the second I did my oral, I never wanted to think about it again. And I was very disappointed. And I had to return again to office work, which sustained me during graduate school. I mean, that's what I did. I didn't do waitressing. I didn't do physical work, but I did do office work. I was a very good secretary. I was a medical transcriber as a graduate student. And then I became a legal secretary here in New York. After I lost my job, I worked for a law firm. I worked up here. I came here and I worked as a secretary to psychiatrists. I was in Austin Riggs, which is a really famous psychiatric hospital. And Judy also, she pieced it together. I mean, and when Judy first came, when I went to Chicago, Judy came to New York, and she was doing night work. Like had part-time work at the 42nd Street Library, for example. So she got night work that in those days, you could really live on part-time work. But in the 60s and the 70s, I mean, I did it also. But by the time the mid 80s and the late 80s, it got harder and harder. The rents went up, everything went up. And so we both struggled. I did less work after the two books came out. I got more invitations to do conferences, to give readings, to give lectures, and even to be guest teacher in places. I flew all over the place. I was always leaving here to go someplace. So it was very difficult. I mean, it was difficult. It got better, a little bit better, when I got the job at Barnard. I mean, I was at Barnard for 22 years, but I was an adjunct the whole time. And so, but it was a steady thing in New York, which was very, very good. I mean, I was tired of schlepping around. And also I did get other kinds of gigs so that it was supplemented. Judy was working at the beginning, but she became sicker and sicker as the first decade. And by 2010, she just had to stop working totally. So, and she died in 2014. And so it was hard. I mean, it was just plain hard. It got easier. It played an important, I mean, in my writing, I wrote a very long short story, which was published in Conditions, and then afterwards in my collection in London, called The Journal of Rachel Robotnik. And it's about a writer, and it juxtaposes her writing with what her daily life is like. That's what I want to sort of show.
And the presence of Tilly Olson figures into this book too. Silences.
Absolutely. She really helped me to focus, understand what I was experiencing. And she really, I mean, I met her. I mean, she was very, very supportive.
Wow.
Yeah, she was quite amazing. So
she made such an impact.
Yeah. Context, Silences was like, I couldn't finish that poem, Context. And then I read her book Silences, and I was able to finish it. I couldn't put it together. And that book made it really, and she read the Journal of Rachel Rabotnik, and she said, this is how, she was very supportive. So it had an enormous, how could you not write about it? I also wrote an essay in my essay book about feminists and the girls at the office, sort of about class issues in the women's movement,
right?
Which I thought not being dealt with that well.
Well, it's just, it just reveals that, art and literature is not inevitable. There are conditions that help sustain it and that are needed for a creative life to flower. And I think what's so powerful about your work is that it's all there, like it's all out, like you reveal the seams. There's no gleaming facade. You take us in to the struggles. And I think, readers have really been moved by and identify with those questions. And so with that, I feel like, again, I said it earlier, I feel like we could talk for another 2 hours, but I do want to thank you, Irena Klepfisz, for joining us on Nice Jewish Books. I want to thank Cheryl Stahl for making sure everything runs smoothly. Cheryl's a regular host. The book is Her Birth and Later Years, New and Collected Poems, 1971 to 2021. And it's out from Wesleyan University Press. And I understand there's also a play based on Irena Klepfish's life that is now being performed. So congratulations, Irena. And folks, look out for that play. I believe it's in Berkeley now.
It's in Berkeley, and it's on starts on the 16th, but I understand they're sold out.
Wonderful. That's a whole other conversation. So congratulations on that. And with that, over to you, Cheryl.
Thanks, Cheryl.
Thank you both so much, Yermiyahu Ahron Taub and Irena Klepfisz, for such a beautiful, rich conversation. I appreciate it both so much. Irena, one last question. If someone would like to get in touch with you, what is the best way?
It's by email. It's my first initial with my last name, but without the Z, IKLEPFIS @barnard.edu.
Okay, wonderful. Well, thank you again, both so much. If you are interested in any of the books we discussed today, you can find them at your favorite physical or online bookstore or at your local library. Thanks to Yankee for use of their Freilich, which definitely makes me happy. This podcast is a project of the Association of Jewish Libraries, and you can find it at jewishlibraries.org/nicejewishbooks. If you would like to support this podcast, please click on the donate button in the top left corner of the podcast page or the link in the show notes. I would like to thank AJL and my podcast mentor, Heidi Rabinowitz. Keep listening for the promo for her latest episode of our sister podcast, The Book of Life, a show about Jewish kidlit, mostly.
Hi, this is Richard Ho, author of Two New Years.
And I'm Lynn Scurfield, the illustrator for Two New Years.
I'd like to dedicate this episode to my kids who are both Chinese and Jewish.
And I'd like to dedicate this episode to my family, my mom's side, who is Chinese, and then my step family, who's Jewish.
And we'd both like to dedicate this episode additionally to all the kids out there that don't fit neatly into a box.
The Book of Life is the sister podcast of Nice Jewish Books. I'm your host, Heidi Rabinowitz, and I podcast about Jewish kidlit. Join me to hear my September 2023 conversation with Richard Ho and Lynn Scurfield about Two New Years.